The phone rang at 4:05 a.m., shattering the silence of Kenji Ryū's Tokyo headquarters. He stared at the encrypted number glowing on the secure line, every instinct sharpening to a blade's edge. In his world, calls at this hour meant war, betrayal, or death. Ryu-san. The voice was tight, clinical. This is Dr. Marchetti, St. Jude's Clinic, Rome. Your wife. Ex-wife, he corrected, his hand tightening around the phone until his knuckles whitened. Your ex-wife, Eliza Sterling, was admitted an hour ago. She's in active labor. Premature. The baby is in distress, and there are complications. A pause. She left strict instructions to contact only you. The room tilted. 7 months. It had been 7 months since he'd signed those divorce papers in silence, since he'd watched Eliza walk out of his London penthouse with the inro he'd given her left behind on his desk like a severed finger. 7 months since she'd disappeared into the European countryside, taking with her the only light that had ever pierced the shadows of his life. 7 months of rigid discipline, of ritual, of cleaning his katana in the pre-dawn hours and pretending the razored focus of his work could cut away the fact that he'd destroyed the one thing the Yakuza code couldn't replace. And she'd been carrying his child. She hadn't told him. I'll be there in 6 hours, he said, already moving toward the door, his pulse a war drum against his ribs, louder than any Oyabun's command he'd ever obeyed. The katana lay forgotten on the silk cloth. 2 years earlier, Eliza Sterling had learned early that integrity wasn't a luxury, it was a currency. At 28, she was one of the youngest senior curators at the European Art Restoration Consortium, known for an eye so sharp she could spot a forged Caravaggio brushstroke from across a room. She lived modestly in a cramped London flat, sent half her paycheck back to her aging parents in Florence, and wore her grandmother's silver saint medallion like armor. She had her pride, her expertise, and a professional reputation built on one unshakable rule: never look the other way. The Kagami Gallery wasn't just any gallery. Everyone in the London art world knew it was a front, pristine, minimalist, breathtakingly curated. Owned by the Ryū-kai, one of the most powerful and untouchable Yakuza syndicates operating in Europe. And Eliza had just been sent to authenticate a piece they desperately needed moved. The Kagami Gallery occupied a converted Victorian warehouse in Southwark, all exposed brick and surgical lighting, where each piece of art was displayed like a specimen under glass. Beautiful, isolated, untouchable. Eliza had been inside exactly twice before. Once for a charity auction where oligarchs bid on Meiji-era ceramics like they were collecting poker chips, and once to authenticate a minor Hiroshige print for a private client who'd paid her fee in cash and never made eye contact. Both times, she'd felt watched by cameras she couldn't see and men in expensive suits who didn't bother to hide the bulges beneath their jackets. This time was no different, except now she knew exactly who was watching. She stood before the hanging scroll, a supposed 14th century Kamakura period Buddhist mandala, her gloved fingers hovering millimeters from the silk like a doctor examining a patient. The European Art Restoration Consortium had sent her because the piece was being donated to the British Museum, and protocol demanded independent verification before the institution could process the tax write-off. Standard procedure. Clean, professional, completely by the book. Except nothing about the Kagami Gallery was by the book. The space was silent except for the whisper of the climate control system and the nearly inaudible hum of the track lighting. Each piece in the gallery was separated by careful meters of white space, as if proximity to other art might contaminate it. Ming vases. Edo period screens. A small Seshu ink painting that Eliza knew, with absolute certainty, had been reported stolen from a private collection in Osaka 3 years ago. She'd recognized it the moment she walked in, and she'd very carefully not looked at it directly since. Some things you saw. Some things you survived by pretending not to see. And then there was the breathing behind her. Kenji Ryū didn't announce himself with footsteps or greetings. He simply existed in the space the way a blade exists in its sheath. Perfectly still, utterly present, supremely dangerous. Eliza had seen his photograph in the gallery literature. Young, severe, handsome in the way that sharp objects are handsome, with the kind of face that suggested aristocratic bloodlines and absolutely no tolerance for incompetence. In person, he was worse. He wore a black suit like it was a second skin, tailored so precisely it might have been stitched directly onto his frame. His dark hair was cut with geometric precision, and when she glanced back over her shoulder, His eyes were fixed on her with the patient, unblinking focus of a predator watching prey decide which direction to run. He didn't smile, didn't bow, didn't offer any of the practiced courtesy that usually accompanied high-level art transactions. "Miss Sterling," he said. His English was perfect, accentless, the kind that came from expensive international schools and years of practice erasing any hint of origin. "I trust the piece meets your standards." It wasn't a question. It was a test. Eliza turned back to the scroll, her heart rate ticking up despite her best efforts to remain clinical. She'd authenticated pieces for oligarchs, for shadowy collectors, for institutions that asked her to verify provenance she knew was fabricated. She'd learned to deliver verdicts with professional detachment, to speak the truth carefully enough that it couldn't be used against her. But this scroll was different. "The silk is correct for the period," she said, her voice steady, professional. "The pigment degradation is consistent with natural aging over approximately 7 centuries. The mounting is museum quality, and the calligraphy demonstrates the characteristic hand of the Kamakura religious schools." But the word hung in the air like a knife balanced on its point. Eliza pulled a small magnifying loupe from her bag and leaned closer, her penlight catching the weave of the fabric in the upper left corner, where the mandala's outer ring of protective deities curved into the border. There. The irregularity was so subtle that most authenticators would have missed it entirely, dismissing it as natural variation in hand-woven silk. But Eliza had spent 12 years studying textile degradation patterns, had written her dissertation on the forensic analysis of Asian silk production, and she knew the difference between natural inconsistency and human intervention. "The weft thread count is inconsistent here," she said quietly, tracing the air a millimeter above the fabric. "It's a patch. Expertly done, nearly invisible under standard examination, but it's covering a previous restoration. Someone repaired damage to this section, likely water damage from the staining pattern, and then artificially re-aged the repair to match the surrounding material." She straightened, her spine rigid, and turned to face Kenji directly. His expression hadn't changed. Not a flicker of surprise or concern. Just that same unnerving stillness, like he was a statue waiting to see if she would finish the thought. She finished it. "This isn't a simple donation, Mr. Ryū. It's a laundering operation. You're using the British Museum's authentication process to legitimize a piece that's been compromised, which will then be discovered, to have additional historical significance, and quietly reclaimed by a private buyer at 5, maybe 10 times its actual value. The museum gets the tax benefit of the donation. You get a clean provenance and a substantial profit. And I get to be the authenticator who signed off on a fraud." The silence that followed was so absolute that Eliza could hear her own pulse hammering in her ears, could hear the distant sound of traffic on the street outside, could hear the infinitesimal creak of Kenji's leather shoes as he shifted his weight. His expression still didn't change, but something behind his eyes sharpened, like a door locking from the inside. "You have a remarkable eye, Miss Sterling," he said softly, his voice carrying the same dangerous gentleness as a sword being drawn from its sheath. It didn't sound like a compliment. It sounded like a death sentence. Eliza lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with the same unflinching directness she used to examine forgeries. "I assume you'll want my official report by end of business tomorrow. I'll note the restoration in my findings and recommend the British Museum decline the donation pending further investigation." She picked up her bag, her movements deliberate and unhurried, and turned toward the door. "Miss Sterling." She stopped but didn't turn around. "There's a car waiting outside," Kenji said. "I'd appreciate a moment of your time before you file that report." It wasn't a request. Eliza's hand tightened on her bag strap, and she thought about her grandmother's favorite piece of advice. Never get in a car with a man who has more to lose than you do. But she also thought about the stolen Seshu painting, about the rumors that the Kagami Gallery was a front for the Ryū-kai Yakuza syndicate, about the fact that she'd just publicly called out one of the most dangerous men in London's criminal underworld. Running would just mean looking over her shoulder for the rest of her life. And Eliza Sterling was tired of being afraid. She turned around and said, "Lead the way." The car was waiting exactly where Kenji had said it would be. A black Mercedes S-Class with windows tinted to full opacity, parked in the loading zone like it owned the street, which Eliza supposed it probably did. The driver was a compact man in his 40s with the economical movements of someone who'd been trained to kill efficiently and didn't waste energy on unnecessary gestures. He opened the rear door without speaking, without making eye contact, without any acknowledgement that Eliza was a person rather than a package being transferred from one location to another. She could have run, should have run, could have called the consortium, called the police, called anyone. Instead, she got in. The interior smelled of leather and the faint, expensive scent of hinoki wood. Kenji slid in beside her, maintaining a careful distance, and the driver closed the door with a soft, final click. The car pulled away from the curb with the smooth inevitability of a river current. "Where are we going?" Eliza asked, proud that her voice remained level. 3 floors up. The private elevator required both a keycard and a thumbprint to activate. The driver stayed with the car. Kenji placed his thumb on the scanner, and the doors whispered open onto a corridor of polished concrete and recessed lighting that looked like it belonged in a museum of modern architecture, not above a London art gallery. They walked in silence, her practical heels clicking against the floor, his handmade Italian shoes making no sound at all, until they reached a seamless white door that opened at Kenji's touch. The office beyond was a study in absolute minimalism. White walls that seemed to glow with their own light. A single desk carved from what appeared to be a solid piece of black granite, its surface empty except for a closed laptop and a single sheet of paper weighted down by a smooth river stone. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Thames, where tourist boats crawled along the water like slow-moving insects. And nothing else. No art, no photographs, no books or awards or any of the personal detritus that accumulated in human workspaces. It was the office of a man who left no traces. Kenji moved behind the desk with the fluid economy of someone who'd made this journey 10,000 times. His hands folded on the granite surface, his posture perfect, his expression giving away absolutely nothing. "Sit," he said. Eliza didn't. "If you're going to threaten me, Mr. Ryū, let's skip the performance. I've already drafted a preliminary report and sent it to my supervisor at the consortium. If anything happens to me, if I miss my scheduled check-in, if I don't submit my final authentication by the deadline, the investigation defaults to the British Museum's fraud department and the Metropolitan Police." It was a complete lie. She'd done none of those things. But her voice didn't waver, and she watched Kenji's face for any micro-expression that would tell her whether he believed her. For the first time since she'd met him, something that might have been amusement flickered across his features. "You're lying," he said calmly. "Your supervisor is Claudia Bertrand, and she's currently in Prague authenticating a private collection for a Saudi prince. She won't be checking email for another 72 hours. You work alone on preliminary assessments, and your reporting protocol doesn't include check-ins unless you're working outside the EU." He tilted his head slightly. "You're also carrying a knockoff mulberry bag, well-made, nearly indistinguishable from the original, but a knockoff nonetheless, which suggests you're operating on a tight budget. Your coat is 3 seasons old. Your shoes have been resold at least once. And you took the tube here instead of a taxi, which means you're calculating every expense." Eliza's throat tightened. "What's your point?" "My point, Miss Sterling, is that I've done my research. I know you send 60% of your income to your family in Florence to cover your father's medical expenses and your mother's caretaking costs. I know you're living in a flat share in Whitechapel that costs you £800 a month. I know you're one of the most talented authentication specialists in Europe, and you're chronically underpaid because you refuse to work for private collectors who don't disclose provenance." He leaned forward slightly. "I know you could have lied about that scroll. Most authenticators would have. But you didn't. And that's why I'm not going to threaten you." "Then what are you going to do?" "I'm going to offer you a job." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Eliza laughed, a short, sharp sound with no humor in it. "You want to hire the woman who just exposed your laundering operation?" "I want to hire the woman who has the skill to expose it," Kenji corrected. "I need someone with your eye, Miss Sterling. Someone who can manage my more sensitive acquisitions. Authentication, provenance verification, discrete restoration work. The pay is £50,000 per project, paid in clean money through a consulting contract that will satisfy any tax authority in the EU. £50,000. Her father's outstanding medical bills were $32,000. The mortgage on her parents' Florence apartment that she'd been helping cover was another $15,000. She'd been calculating how to stretch her consortium salary to cover both, and failing, for the past 8 months. You mean you need someone to legitimize your forgeries, she said flatly. I mean I need someone who won't look the other way when it matters. Kenji's gaze locked onto hers with an intensity that felt like being pinned under a spotlight. You could have missed that restoration, Ms. Sterling. You could have approved the piece, collected your fee, and walked away. 99% of authenticators would have. But you saw the flaw and you told the truth, even though you knew exactly who I was and what calling me out might cost you. He paused. That kind of integrity is rare. That kind of precision is invaluable. And I'm willing to pay for both. And if I refuse? His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes went cold. Then you walk out of this office and we never speak again. I'll withdraw the donation to the British Museum and cite scheduling conflicts. Your report will be filed and forgotten. And you'll go back to your flat share in Whitechapel and your 60-hour work weeks. And you'll keep sending money to Florence until you have nothing left. He leaned back in his chair. But you'll spend the rest of your career wondering if I'm watching. Wondering if that private collector who hires you is connected to me. Wondering if the next piece you authenticate is a test. It should have sounded like a threat. Instead, it sounded like a promise. Eliza's hands were shaking, so she gripped her bag tighter to hide it. What are your terms? 3 rules, Kenji said, his voice flat and precise as a contract reading. 1. You don't ask questions about where pieces come from or where they're going. You authenticate what I give you, and you provide documentation that will satisfy institutional scrutiny. 2. You don't keep records. No copies of reports, no photographs, no personal files. Everything stays in this office. 3. You never, ever lie to me. If a piece is compromised, you tell me. If you can't verify provenance, you tell me. If you think I'm making a mistake, you tell me. His eyes narrowed slightly. I can work with truth. I can't work with people who tell me what they think I want to hear. And the secrecy? You'll sign an NDA with financial penalties substantial enough to bankrupt 3 generations of your family. You'll also sign a consulting contract that pays you a retainer of £10,000 per month, with project bonuses on top. £10,000 a month. That was more than she made in 4 months at the consortium. It was enough to clear her father's debts. Enough to secure her parents' apartment. Enough to finally stop waking up at 3 a.m. doing calculations in her head about which bills she could delay and which emergency she couldn't afford. It was also enough to compromise every principle she'd built her career on. Eliza looked at Kenji Ryū, this dangerous, meticulous, utterly ruthless man who ran a criminal empire disguised as an art gallery, and knew she was making a deal with someone who would own a piece of her soul the moment she agreed. She sat down. When do I start? 3 months into working for Kenji Ryū, Eliza had developed a working theory. The man was at least 2 people wearing the same face, and she had no idea which one was real. There was the Kenji who ran the Ryū-kai with surgical precision, who could silence a room full of dangerous men with a single glance, whose name was whispered in the back rooms of auction houses and private galleries across 3 continents. That Kenji was ice and razors, a man who'd turned emotional distance into an art form, who spoke in careful sentences that gave away nothing and committed to nothing. He conducted business meetings in 3 languages and ended them with the kind of polite dismissals that felt like doors being locked from the inside. That Kenji was exactly what she'd expected when she took the job. A Yakuza boss using art as a front for money laundering and smuggling operations she very carefully didn't ask about. And then there was the other Kenji, the one who spent 45 minutes examining a 12th century tea bowl with the reverence of a pilgrim touching a holy relic, murmuring about the way the glaze had cracked over centuries and the philosophy of wabi-sabi, finding beauty in imperfection. The one who'd quietly funded an entire pediatric wing at St. Thomas Hospital under a shell corporation, and only mentioned it when Eliza found the donation receipt while filing paperwork. The one who once corrected her translation of a Basho haiku with something dangerously close to tenderness in his voice, and then spent 20 minutes discussing the untranslatable nature of aware, the poignant awareness of the transience of things. That Kenji was a man who understood art not as commodity, but as language, who saw beauty as something worth protecting even in a world built on violence. Eliza didn't know which version was the mask. She suspected, increasingly, that neither of them were. The call came at 11:38 p.m. on a Thursday in October, interrupting her 3rd glass of wine, and her attempt to not think about the way Kenji's hands had brushed hers when he'd handed her a portfolio of provenance documents that afternoon. The contact lasted less than a second, but her skin had remembered it for the 6 hours since. The number on her phone was unknown. She almost didn't answer. "Yes, Ms. Sterling." The voice was young, male, and tight with barely controlled panic. "This is Yuki. I work for Ryū-san. There's been an incident. He needs medical attention, but he refuses a hospital," he said. A pause, the sound of muffled conversation in rapid Japanese. "He said if anyone was going to see him like this, it should be you." Her wine glass hit the coffee table. "What kind of incident?" "Please. The penthouse. Come alone. Don't call anyone." The line went dead. Eliza should have called the police. Should have called an ambulance. Should have done literally anything except what she did, which was grab her coat and bag and run for the tube station like she was trying to outrun her own common sense. The penthouse was in Canary Wharf, occupying the top 2 floors of a glass tower that looked like a piece of the future had landed in East London. The doorman didn't stop her. Apparently she'd been expected. And the private elevator opened directly into a living space that was somehow even more minimalist than Kenji's office. White walls. Low furniture in shades of gray and black. A single piece of art on the wall. A massive ink painting of a tsunami. All violence and negative space. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Thames. The city spread out below like a circuit board of light. And blood on the white marble floor leading toward the bathroom. "Kenji." Her voice echoed in the space. No answer. She followed the blood trail. Not drops, but smears like someone had been dragging themselves. And found the bathroom door half open, light spilling out into the hallway. Kenji was slumped against the marble sink, his black shirt soaked through with blood from a knife wound in his left side. His face was gray, his breathing shallow and labored, and there was blood on his hands where he'd been trying to apply pressure to the wound. When he saw her in the doorway, his eyes sharpened with something that looked like fury. "I told Yuki not to call you," he rasped, his voice strained. "Well, he did, so shut up and let me look." Eliza was already moving, her hands steady despite the fear turning her stomach to acid. She'd never done battlefield medicine, had never stitched human skin. But she'd restored 400-year-old canvas and worked with materials so fragile they would disintegrate at the wrong touch. Precision was precision, whether the medium was art or flesh. She knelt beside him, her hands already assessing the wound with clinical detachment. "This needs a hospital, Kenji. You need." "No hospitals." His hand closed around her wrist, weak but insistent. "No records. No police reports. There's a field kit under the sink." Of course there was. She found it exactly where he said. A professional tactical medical kit, the kind used by military field medics, with sterile sutures and local anesthetic and surgical tools that had no business being in a civilian bathroom. She laid it out on the floor with shaking hands, her mind cataloging what she'd need. Clean the wound, assess for arterial damage, anesthetic, sutures, antibacterial, bandaging. "This is insane," she muttered, pulling on sterile gloves. "Welcome to my world," Kenji said, and the ghost of dark humor in his voice made her want to hit him. She worked in silence, her movements methodical and precise. Cleaned the wound, not deep enough to hit organs, thank God, but bleeding badly. Injected local anesthetic. Waited for it to take effect while applying pressure, her hands slick with his blood. And then, when he nodded that the area was numb, she began to stitch. Small stitches. Even tension. The same technique she used to repair torn canvas, except this canvas was warm and alive and belonged to a man who was watching her with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. He didn't make a sound the entire time. Not a hiss of pain, not a flinch, nothing. Just that unwavering focus, like he was memorizing the exact angle of her hands, the precise way she bit her lower lip when she concentrated. When she finally tied off the last suture, her hands were shaking so badly she had to sit on the floor. The adrenaline was draining out of her system, leaving her hollow and trembling. Kenji slid down beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat of his skin, the too-fast rhythm of his pulse. "You didn't have to come," he said quietly. "I know. Why did you?" She turned to look at him. This dangerous, impossible, infuriating man who just trusted her with his life, and realized with a clarity that felt like falling off a cliff. She was in love with him. Not the Yakuza boss. Not the art collector. not the carefully constructed persona he showed the world. The man underneath, who bled like anyone else and refused to let anyone see it. Because you would have bled out alone, she whispered. And I can't. His hand found hers in the space between them, his fingers threading through hers, and the touch was so gentle it broke something in her chest. Eliza. She kissed him, hard and desperate and terrified, tasting antiseptic and copper and the salt of her own tears. He made a sound against her mouth, surprise or surrender or both. And then his hand was in her hair, cradling the back of her head like she was something precious, and he was kissing her back with the same desperate intensity. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, his forehead rested against hers. "This is a terrible idea," he said, his voice rough. "The worst," she agreed. "I can't offer you anything but danger." "I know, Eliza." "I know," she said again, and kissed him softer this time, slower, like she was memorizing the shape of his mouth, the way he tasted like green tea and iron and something she couldn't name. "I know what you are. I know what this costs. And I don't care." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes searching hers for something, doubt, fear, an escape route. "I care," he said softly. "You deserve better than this. Better than me. Don't tell me what I deserve." She gripped the front of his ruined shirt, holding him close. "I've spent my whole life being careful, being smart, making the right choices. And I'm tired, Kenji. I'm tired of being afraid of wanting something that isn't safe." His hand cupped her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "If we do this," he said, "if we cross this line, there's no going back. My world doesn't allow for casual. It doesn't allow for mistakes." "Then don't make any," she whispered, and pulled him into another kiss. They made love on the bathroom floor like they were trying to outrun consequences, surrounded by bloodstained gauze and the clinical smell of antiseptic. It was clumsy and desperate, and nothing like the romantic fantasies Eliza had imagined in weaker moments. His side was injured so he couldn't move properly, and she was terrified of hurting him, and they both kept having to stop to laugh at the absurdity of it all. The Yakuza boss and the art curator, fumbling in the aftermath of violence. But when he whispered her name like a prayer, when he looked at her like she was the only beautiful thing in his world of calculated brutality, she knew she'd just made the best and worst decision of her life. And she'd make it again. 6 months after the night she stitched Kenji back together on his bathroom floor, he asked her to marry him in a language neither of them had spoken before. Vulnerability without strategy. They were in his penthouse, the city glittering 40 stories below like scattered diamonds, and rain was streaking the floor-to-ceiling windows in patterns that looked like calligraphy. Eliza had started keeping a toothbrush there, then a change of clothes, then entire drawers of her things that migrated into his space like she was slowly colonizing his carefully controlled world. They never spoke about what they were doing, never defined the relationship in terms that could be weaponized. In Kenji's world, words like love and forever got people killed. But he made her green tea the way she liked it, with a specific temperature and steeping time he'd memorized. He bought first editions of her favorite poetry in Italian and left them on her pillow. He traced the path of her collarbones with his fingertips like he was studying a priceless artifact, and whispered things in Japanese he wouldn't translate, and looked at her sometimes with an expression so raw it made her forget how to breathe. She knew she was in love with him. She suspected, hoped, prayed that he felt the same. But they'd never said it. And then, on a Thursday evening in April when cherry blossoms were blooming in the city parks and everything smelled like rain and possibility, Kenji came home early from a meeting and found her curled on his sofa reading Dante, and knelt in front of her holding a small lacquered box. An inro, no bigger than a matchbox, made of black lacquer decorated with gold cranes in flight, so old and exquisite that Eliza knew immediately it was worth a fortune. "In my world," Kenji said quietly, his eyes locked on hers, "we don't make promises we can't keep. We don't speak about things like love or forever, because those words are vulnerabilities that enemies exploit. People I care about become targets. Attachments become leverage." His thumb traced the edge of the inro, reverent and careful. "But this belonged to my grandmother. She gave it to my grandfather the night before he went to war, and he carried it for 30 years. Through occupation and rebuilding and all the years that came after. It's the only thing I own that was given freely, without transaction or obligation." Eliza's breath caught. "I can't give you safety, Kenji continued, his voice rough with an emotion she'd never heard from him before. I can't give you a normal life. I can't introduce you to my associates, or take you to family dinners, or do any of the things people do when they're building a future together. But I can give you the truth, and the truth is this. You are the only thing in this world I would choose over power. You're the only person who's ever seen past the performance and stayed anyway. He opened the inro, revealing a simple gold band inside. Marry me. Not in London, not anywhere our worlds can touch us. Marry me somewhere we can pretend, just for a moment, that we're no one. That we're just two people who chose each other. Eliza's eyes filled with tears, blurring the cranes on the inro into streaks of gold. Yes, she whispered. Yes, God, yes. They flew to Venice the next day. Kenji made a single phone call, used a network she didn't ask about, and within 24 hours they were standing in a private chapel on the island of Torcello. A place so quiet you could hear the lagoon breathing against the ancient stones. The chapel was small and perfect, all frescoes and worn marble, presided over by an elderly priest who asked no questions and spoke only in blessings. Eliza wore a simple cream dress she'd bought that morning from a boutique near the Rialto Bridge, her dark hair loose and threaded with small white flowers the shopkeeper had insisted she take. Kenji wore a dark suit with no tie, his hair still damp from the rain. And when he looked at her walking toward him down the short aisle, his expression was so unguarded it felt like watching him bleed. The ceremony was in Italian and Latin, words neither of them fully understood but felt in the bones. When the priest asked if they took each other, Kenji answered in Japanese first, a soft, fierce hi, and then in English. I do. For as long as she'll have me. Eliza's voice shook. I do. For as long as we both survive this. It should have been romantic. Instead, it was honest. When the priest pronounced them married, Kenji kissed her like he was sealing a contract written in hope and desperation, and Eliza tasted salt. His tears or hers, she couldn't tell. They spent 3 days in Venice, hiding in a rented palazzo that overlooked the Grand Canal, living like they were normal people with normal futures. They made love in rooms decorated with centuries-old frescoes, ate pasta in tiny trattorias where no one knew their names, walked through fog-soaked streets hand in hand like they had all the time in the world. They barely slept. They talked about art and philosophy and the untranslatable nature of beauty. They didn't talk about the Ryū-kai, or the consortium, or the fact that their marriage was a secret that would get them both killed if the wrong people found out. On their last night, they stood on the palazzo's balcony watching the city lights reflect on the dark water. And Kenji wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. When this life is over, he said quietly, when I've built something clean, when I can walk away from everything I've been, we'll come back here. We'll buy a place with a view of the water. We'll live like this every day. Eliza turned in his arms, studying his face in the dim light. Do you really think you can walk away? For you. His hand cupped her cheek, his thumb tracing her lower lip. I'd burn it all down. She wanted to believe him. She kissed him instead of answering, because promises made in Venice were beautiful, fragile things that rarely survived the return to reality. But for 3 perfect days they pretended. They pretended the world outside didn't exist. Pretended that he was just a man who loved art, and she was just a woman who loved him. Pretended that love was enough to rewrite the rules of a world built on blood and honor and ancient codes. And when they flew back to London, they kept pretending. Eliza moved more of her things into the penthouse, until her flat share in Whitechapel was just a forwarding address and a memory. She wore the inro on a chain around her neck, hidden under her clothes where no one could see. Kenji touched the ring on her finger when they were alone, spinning it absently like he was confirming she was real. They built a life in the margins, stolen hours between her consortium work and his meetings with men whose names she didn't know. Secret dinners in the penthouse. Mornings waking up tangled together. The careful choreography of loving someone whose world had no room for love. It should have been enough. For a year, she convinced herself it was. And then she found the documents, and the entire beautiful lie shattered like Murano glass. You've stayed through the proposal, the secret wedding, the 3 days in Venice where they pretended the world didn't exist. If you're still here, it's because you understand that the best love stories are the ones that acknowledge the cost. Most people scroll past the hard parts. You didn't. That makes you part of something rare. A community that doesn't flinch when things get complicated. Subscribe. Stay. Let's see how deep this goes together. Because the betrayal that's coming? You're going to want to be here for it. A year of marriage had taught Eliza Sterling Ryū to navigate the careful geography of Kenji's silences. There was the silence of focus, when he studied a piece of art or reviewed contracts in 3 languages, his mind a precision instrument slicing through complexity with surgical efficiency. She'd learned not to interrupt that silence, to simply exist in the same space and let him work, occasionally refilling his tea or leaving food he'd forget to eat within reach. There was the silence of exhaustion, when he came home from meetings she wasn't allowed to know about, meetings that left him hollowed out and distant, and simply pulled her against him like she was the only gravity that mattered, the only thing keeping him tethered to something human. She'd learned to hold him during that silence, to ask no questions, to let him take what he needed from her presence until he could breathe normally again. And there was the silence of secrets. That one felt like a wall going up between them, brick by invisible brick, until she was on the outside looking in at a man she'd married but didn't fully know. That silence had always existed. She'd known from the beginning that there would be parts of Kenji's world she couldn't access, rooms in his life that were locked against her for her own protection. But lately it had grown deeper, more pervasive, like he was carrying something so heavy it was bending him out of shape. She told herself she was imagining it, that the nature of his work demanded compartmentalization, that loving a man like Kenji meant accepting that transparency had limits, that some truths were too dangerous to share. She told herself she was being paranoid, that marriage to a Yakuza boss meant living with unanswered questions, that trust sometimes looked like not asking. And then she found the documents, and every lie she'd been telling herself ignited like paper in a fire. It was a Saturday in November, gray and cold, the kind of London morning where the sun never quite managed to rise. Kenji had been called to an emergency meeting at 6 a.m., terse Japanese on the phone, his face going carefully blank, and left with a kiss to her forehead and a promise to be back by evening. Eliza had the penthouse to herself, rare and peaceful, and she'd planned to spend it doing authentications for the consortium. She needed the provenance file for a Ming Dynasty vase she was evaluating, and Kenji had mentioned keeping historical documentation in his home office. The one room in the penthouse she generally avoided because it felt too much like trespassing, but he'd told her where the files were, had explicitly said she could access them if she needed documentation for her work. So she went looking. The office was as minimalist as every other space Kenji inhabited. A black desk, a single chair, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Canary Wharf, and a wall of filing cabinets that were probably worth more than most people's cars. She found the cabinet marked Provenance, Asian Antiquities, and pulled it open, her fingers walking through impeccably organized folders until she found the one she needed. As she pulled the file free, her hand brushed against something in the back of the drawer. A hidden release mechanism, the kind she'd seen 100 times in antique furniture, designed to reveal a secret compartment. She should have left it alone. Instead, her curator's instincts, the same ones that could spot a forged brushstroke from across a room, made her press the release. A drawer slid open with a whisper of expensive engineering. Inside was a single folder, marked with a red wax seal she'd seen on Yakuza correspondence before. Confidential, Sakazuki Agreement. Ryū-kai/Sadogumi Alliance. Her hands were shaking as she pulled it out. The documents inside were in Japanese, densely written in the formal legal language she'd been learning from Kenji over the past year. She couldn't read all of it. The kanji was too complex, the phrasing too technical, but she could parse enough. Structure, names, dates, terms of alliance between 2 Yakuza clans. And then, halfway through the contract, in a section labeled Mutual Assurances and Collateral, she saw her own name. Eliza Sterling Ryū. Marriage certified. Date, European national. Documented familial ties, Florence, Italy. To serve as human assurance of Ryū-kai commitment to alliance terms per traditional Sakazuki protocol. In the event of Ryū-kai breach of agreement, subject to reclamation by Sadogumi leadership as per Article 12, Section 4. The words blurred. Her vision tunneled. Human assurance. Reclamation. Traditional protocol. She'd heard the stories, whispered in the back rooms of auction houses and galleries, about Yakuza tactics that belonged to a different century. Wives, daughters, sisters used as living collateral in clan agreements, their safety contingent on the honor of men who'd built empires on violence and tradition. She'd thought they were exaggerations, ghost stories meant to make the criminal underworld seem more exotic and dangerous than it really was. She'd been wrong. She kept reading, her hands trembling so badly the pages rattled. The marriage contract, their marriage contract, the one they'd signed in Venice while she wore flowers in her hair and believed in forever, had been filed as proof of commitment. Her family's address in Florence was listed, along with photographs she'd never consented to. Her parents at a cafe, her mother shopping at the market, her father walking to his doctor's appointment. They'd been surveilled, documented, catalogued as leverage. The folders slipped from her hands, scattering pages across Kenji's immaculate floor like evidence at a crime scene. She'd married him in Venice, believing she was choosing love. He'd married her to close a deal. Her chest felt like someone had reached inside and crushed her lungs. The room tilted. She gripped the edge of the desk, trying to breathe through the panic, through the betrayal, through the sick realization that every beautiful moment, Venice, the Inro, the whispered promises, had been built on a foundation of lies. Or not lies. Worse. Omissions. Strategic silences. The things Kenji was best at. She didn't hear him come home. Didn't know he was there until his voice cut through the roaring in her ears. Quiet and careful and already devastated because he knew. He knew the moment he saw her face exactly what she'd found. Eliza. Don't. The word came out strangled. She straightened, turning to face him, and watched his expression shatter when he saw the papers scattered on the floor between them. Don't say my name like it means something to you, when I'm apparently just a line item in a contract. Kenji's face went carefully blank, the mask sliding into place, the Yakuza boss replacing the man she'd thought she knew, but his eyes were devastated. Let me explain. Explain. Her laugh was broken glass and acid. Explain what exactly? That you married me to prove your commitment to a deal with the Sato family? That my life, my parents' lives, are collateral in some fucked up power play between criminal syndicates? That everything we built was just you controlling variables? It's not. It wasn't. He took a step toward her and she backed away, holding up a hand like she could physically stop him. Don't come near me. He stopped and she saw it then, the crack in his armor, the flash of genuine pain beneath the control. It made her want to scream. Was any of it real? Her voice broke on the question. Venice. The Inro. The promises about building something clean, about coming back when you could walk away from your world. Tears were streaming down her face now, hot and furious. Or was I always just a valuable asset you needed to secure? Everything with you is real. The words came out rough, desperate, and he ran a hand through his hair. The first uncontrolled gesture she'd seen from him in months. I love you. God, Eliza, I have loved you since the moment you called me out in the gallery. Since you looked at me like I was a problem to solve instead of a threat to survive. The marriage, Venice, every moment between us, that's real. Then why? She grabbed the contract pages, shaking them at him. Why would you do this? Why would you use our marriage as collateral? Why would you put my family under surveillance? Why would you turn the only honest thing in your life into another fucking transaction? Because it was the only way to protect you. Kenji's voice cracked, loud and raw in the quiet office. The Sato alliance was necessary to prevent a war that would have killed hundreds. They demanded assurances. They demanded collateral. If I refused, if I showed weakness, they would have investigated everyone connected to me. And they would have found you. They would have discovered you before the marriage, before there was any official protection, and you would have become a target anyway. He took a shaking breath. This way you're valuable. This way, they have a vested interest in keeping you safe. This way, I control the variables. I'm not a variable. Her scream echoed off the white walls. I'm not a piece of art you can lock away in climate-controlled storage. I'm not a problem you can solve by manipulating information and controlling who knows what. I'm a person, Kenji. I'm your wife. And you used me. I was trying to protect you. By lying to me. By filing our marriage as collateral without telling me. By having my parents photographed like their surveillance targets. She yanked the chain from around her neck. The one holding the Inro he'd given her in place of a proposal. And the delicate link snapped. She threw it on the desk between them, the beautiful lacquered box bouncing once before settling in the wreckage of scattered papers. You want to protect me? Here's an idea. Treat me like a partner instead of a possession. Trust me with the truth instead of deciding what I can handle. Let me choose the risks I take instead of making those choices for me. Kenji stared at the inro like she'd just torn out his heart and dropped it on the desk. When he looked up, his face was destroyed. "I can't," he said quietly. "I can't risk you choosing to leave. I can't risk you deciding the danger isn't worth it. I can't." His voice broke. "I can't lose you. You already have." The words felt like they were being torn out of her chest. "I want a divorce." The silence that followed was absolute. Final. A door slamming shut on everything they'd been. Kenji's face went completely blank. Every trace of emotion erased like he was powering down, shutting off, becoming the untouchable Oyabun who felt nothing and needed no one. "I'll have the papers drawn up," he said, his voice flat and professional as a business transaction. "You'll be financially protected. The Sato agreement will be voided. You and your family will be removed from the collateral terms. Legally, you'll have everything you need." "I don't want your money," Eliza said, her voice hollow. "I wanted your honesty. I wanted a partner. I wanted someone who saw me as an equal, not an asset to manage." "I know." He turned away from her, looking out at the gray London skyline. "I'm sorry I couldn't be that person." She left that night. Walked out of the Canary Wharf penthouse with a single suitcase holding clothes and books, and nothing that had been a gift from him, because she couldn't bear to touch anything that carried his touch. She didn't look back. Didn't let herself cry until she was in the taxi. And then she broke down so completely the driver asked if she needed a hospital. She spent one night in her old flat share in Whitechapel. Her former roommate was traveling, the space empty and cold, and then bought a one-way ticket to Rome. The divorce papers arrived by courier 2 weeks later, professionally drafted, obscenely generous. He'd settled enough money on her to live comfortably for the rest of her life. Had established trusts for her parents. Had included documentation that the Sato Gumi had formally released all claims on her and her family. The alliance restructured without human collateral. He'd fixed everything he could fix with money and power. Everything except the betrayal. She signed the papers at her parents' kitchen table at 2 a.m., her hand cramping around the pen, and mailed them back with no return address. 2 weeks after that, she missed her period. The pregnancy test sat on the edge of the bathroom sink like a piece of evidence. 2 pink lines delivering a verdict she had no idea how to process. She was carrying the child of a man she'd loved enough to marry in secret and hated enough to divorce. A man who'd built their entire relationship on omissions and strategic control. A man who would absolutely, without question, use their child the same way he'd used their marriage. As leverage, as protection, as another variable in an equation she'd never consented to being part of. She made a decision that felt like survival. She didn't tell him. She moved into a small apartment near the Borghese Gardens. Took a remote consulting position with a French auction house that didn't require travel. And disappeared into the kind of anonymous quiet that Rome offered if you knew where to hide. She built a life measured in doctor's appointments and prenatal vitamins and the slow, relentless expansion of her body around a secret that grew heavier every day. At night, alone in the dark, she would rest her hand on her belly and whisper apologies to the child she hadn't planned but already loved with a fierceness that terrified her. "I'm sorry your father is brilliant and broken. I'm sorry I loved him. I'm sorry I'm keeping you from him. I'm sorry I don't know if that makes me protective or cruel." 7 months passed like a held breath. And then her water broke at 4:05 a.m. on a Tuesday in June, 5 weeks too early, and the carefully constructed isolation she'd built shattered like the inrose chain. The only name she gave the clinic, the only person she asked them to call, was the man she'd sworn she'd never speak to again. Because in the end, when her son was in distress and her own life was on the line, there was only one person in the world she trusted to come. Even if she hated him for it. Rome swallowed Eliza whole, and she let it. Her parents didn't ask questions when she arrived at their Trastevere apartment at midnight with a single suitcase and eyes swollen from crying. Her mother just held her while she shattered, and her father quietly converted his study into a bedroom, moving his collection of medical journals without a word of complaint. They gave her space and silence, and the kind of unconditional harbor that only family could provide when the world had burned down. The divorce papers arrived 3 days later via international courier, delivered in a leather portfolio that probably cost more than her monthly consortium salary. Inside, the settlement was obscene. Property transfers, trust funds, investment portfolios, all structured through legitimate channels with her name on every document. Kenji had given her everything he could give. everything except honesty. She signed them in the kitchen at 2 a.m., her signature shaking across the lines, and sent them back with no return address. 2 weeks later, she took a pregnancy test in her parents' cramped bathroom and watched 2 pink lines appear like a verdict she hadn't prepared for. She was carrying Kenji Ryū's child, the man she'd loved enough to marry in Venice. The man she'd divorced for using that marriage as collateral. The man who would absolutely, without question, turn their child into another variable to control, another piece on the board of his ruthlessly ordered world. So she made a choice that felt like self-preservation. She didn't tell him. She moved into a small apartment near the Borghese Gardens. 2 rooms with terracotta floors and windows overlooking a quiet piazza where old women fed stray cats and nobody asked her story. She took a remote consulting position with a French auction house, work she could do from her laptop without traveling, without exposure. She stopped checking news feeds for mentions of the Ryū-kai, stopped translating Japanese poetry, stopped wearing anything that reminded her of the year she'd spent loving a man made of secrets and sharp edges. She built a life measured in prenatal vitamins and doctor's appointments and the slow, relentless transformation of her body around a truth she was keeping from the only person who had a right to know it. At night, when she couldn't sleep, she would rest her hand on the growing curve of her belly and whisper apologies. "I'm sorry your father is beautiful and broken. I'm sorry I loved him. I'm sorry I'm keeping you from him. But I don't know how to trust him with you when he couldn't trust me with the truth." Her mother suspected but said nothing. Her father researched pediatricians and made discreet inquiries about dual citizenship. They built a conspiracy of protection around her, asking nothing, offering everything. 7 months passed like a held breath. And then her water broke at 4:05 a.m. on a Tuesday in June, 5 weeks too early, and every carefully constructed wall of isolation crumbled. The contractions came fast and brutal, nothing like the gradual progression the birthing books had described. Her mother called an ambulance. The paramedics took one look at her and started moving with urgent efficiency. At the clinic, a doctor with kind eyes and clinical hands examined her and said words like premature, distress, complications. They asked for emergency contacts. She gave them one name. Not her parents, who were already there. Not friends from the consortium, who didn't know she'd been married or divorced or pregnant. Just one name, pulled from some desperate, terrified place in her chest that remembered the night she'd stitched him back together on a bathroom floor. The way he'd trusted her with his life when trust didn't come naturally to him. Kenji Ryū, she gasped between contractions. London, the Kagami Gallery. Tell him his wife needs him. Ex-wife, her mother corrected gently. Tell him anyway, Eliza said, and then another contraction tore through her, and she stopped being able to form words at all. Kenji Ryū had crossed 6 time zones in 6 hours, but the 50 meters from the clinic entrance to Eliza's room felt longer than the entire flight from Tokyo. The nurse who led him down the corridor was a compact woman in her 50s with efficient hands and eyes that had seen too many men fail this exact test. She stopped outside a door marked restricted, high-risk delivery, and turned to assess him with clinical precision. She's been in active labor for 3 hours, the nurse said in accented English. The baby is 5 weeks premature. There's cord compression causing fetal distress. We're monitoring continuously, but if the distress worsens, we'll need to perform an emergency cesarean. She paused, letting the weight of that information settle. Your wife. Ex-wife, Kenji said automatically, the correction like broken glass in his mouth. The nurse's expression didn't change. Your ex-wife has been asking for you. Repeatedly. Don't make her regret it. She opened the door. Eliza was half reclined in the hospital bed, her dark curly hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, her face contorted with pain and exhaustion. She wore a pale blue hospital gown, and her hands were clenched white-knuckled around the bed rails like she was physically trying to hold herself together. And 4 lines snaked into her left arm. Monitors beeped in a regular, frantic rhythm that made Kenji's chest constrict. When she saw him, something cracked in her expression, relief and fury and desperation all colliding at once. You came, she gasped. Did you think I wouldn't? He was beside her before he'd consciously decided to move, his hand covering hers on the rail. Her skin was clammy, trembling. Eliza! A contraction cut him off, and she doubled over with a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Raw and animal and utterly vulnerable. He could orchestrate the destruction of rival syndicates, could order violence with a word, could negotiate million-pound deals without his pulse changing. But watching her in pain unmade every piece of armor he'd ever built. When the contraction passed, she collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face. "The baby," she whispered. "He's in distress. They said if he doesn't stabilize, if his heart rate doesn't." Her voice broke. "He will." Kenji's voice came out hard and absolute, the same tone he used to issue commands that shaped the fates of organizations. But his hand was infinitely gentle when he brushed the sweat-soaked hair from her forehead. "He will because he's yours. And you don't break. I broke when I left you." "No." He leaned closer, his forehead nearly touching hers, breathing the same air. "You survived me. There's a difference." The next 2 hours were warfare of a kind Kenji had never trained for. He stayed beside her through every contraction, letting her grip his hand hard enough that he felt bones grind, murmuring things in Japanese he'd never said in any language. Things about strength and courage and how she was magnificent, how she was stronger than any army he'd ever commanded, how he was sorry, so goddamn sorry for every way he'd failed her. When the doctor finally said, "It's time to push," Kenji felt his heartbeat synchronize with the monitors, with Eliza's ragged breathing, with the desperate rhythm of new life fighting to exist. And when their son finally slipped into the world, small and furious and perfect, his cry piercing the clinical quiet like a declaration of war against every odd that had been stacked against him. Kenji Ryū, who had never wept, not when his father died, not when he took his Oyabun oaths, not through a decade of blood and isolation, broke completely. "Kai," Eliza whispered, cradling the impossibly tiny infant against her chest. Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling, radiant despite her exhaustion. "His name is Kai. Ocean. Vast and unconquerable and free." Kenji reached out with a shaking hand and touched his son's impossibly small fingers. They curled around his thumb immediately, instinctive and trusting, and something in his chest cracked open. A door he hadn't known was locked, flooding him with an emotion he had no vocabulary for. "Hello, Kai," he whispered in Japanese. "I'm your father, and I promise I will be better for you than I was for her." Eliza's eyes met his over their son's head, and for the first time in 7 months, she didn't look away. They let him stay while Eliza slept, while Kai was measured and weighed and tested, and declared miraculously healthy despite his early arrival. Kenji sat in the chair beside her bed, watching the rise and fall of her breathing, the way her hand stayed protectively curved around the plastic bassinet, even in exhausted sleep. He'd built an empire on the principle that love was weakness, that attachment was leverage waiting to be exploited. He'd been catastrophically, irredeemably wrong. When Eliza finally woke, groggy and disoriented, her body still recovering from the trauma of birth, she found him exactly where she'd left him, his suit rumpled beyond recognition, his carefully maintained composure in complete ruins. "You stayed," she said, her voice hoarse. "I'll always stay. If you let me." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and spoke without strategy for the first time in his life. "The Sato alliance is over. I spent the last 5 months systematically dismantling their operations, their smuggling routes, their financial networks, their political connections. It cost me alliances that took a decade to build. The Sakazuki bond is void. I broke it the day you left." Eliza stared at him, her eyes widening. "You destroyed your own coalition?" "I destroyed anything that put you in danger." His jaw tightened. "But I did it the same way I've done everything. In secret, through control, believing I could manipulate the variables perfectly enough to keep you safe without admitting I was the biggest threat to your safety." "Kenji, I used you," he said, the words like gravel and broken glass. "I told myself it was protection, strategy, necessity. But it was control. I couldn't separate the man I wanted to be from the monster I'd spent years becoming." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document, official and stamped with seals she recognized. "This is my formal severance from the Ryū-kai Oyabun title. I'm out. Completely. The legitimate holdings, the gallery, the authentication network, the auction partnerships, those are clean. Everything else I've sold or dismantled." Her hand trembled as she took the document. "You're walking away from the Yakuza? For what?" "For him." Kenji glanced at the bassinet where Kai slept, impossibly small and perfect. "For you. For the chance to be something other than my father's legacy." He met her gaze, unflinching. "I can't undo the betrayal. I can't give you back the year I stole with my lies. But I can promise you absolute transparency from this moment forward. No secrets. No omissions. No controlling variables. His voice dropped to something raw and desperate. Let me prove I can be the man you married in Venice. The one you believed in before I destroyed that belief. Eliza's eyes filled with tears. I'm terrified you'll fail. I'm terrified I will too. He reached for her hand, hesitant, giving her every chance to refuse. But I'd rather fail trying to be honest with you than succeed at being the man who lost you. She looked at their joined hands, at the bassinet where their son slept, at the official document that represented Kenji choosing to dismantle his entire world. Transparency is the new code, she whispered. Transparency is the new code, he echoed like an oath. And in the space between them, something broken began tentatively to heal. The villa in Florence was a 16th-century stone estate nestled in the hills of Fiesole, overlooking the city like a Renaissance painting rendered in amber light and cypress shadows. Kenji had purchased it 2 weeks after Kai's birth, through a legitimate holding company with Eliza's name on every document. No shell corporations, no hidden ownership, just a home bought legally and given freely. You can hate it, he said when he first brought her to see it. Kai sleeping in a carrier strapped to his chest in a configuration that made the former Yakuza boss look absurdly, perfectly domestic. We can find somewhere else. I just thought, your family is here. Your parents can visit. And it's far enough from London that we can start over without ghosts. Eliza walked through rooms filled with original frescoes and sunlight, her fingers trailing over walls that had stood for 5 centuries, and felt something in her chest unclench for the first time since she'd found those documents in his office. It's perfect, she whispered. They moved in a month later. The first 6 months were an exercise in relearning each other with honesty as the foundation instead of omission. Kenji showed her every document, every business decision, every communication with his former associates as he carefully, methodically extricated himself from the Ryū-kai's remaining operations. Eliza showed him her fears, about trusting him again, about whether love could survive betrayal, about raising a son in the shadow of the world his father had left behind. They fought. They cried. They rebuilt trust in inches and millimeters, brick by painful brick. And 6 months after moving to Florence, on a morning when the olive groves were silver with autumn dew, they held a renewal ceremony in the villa's garden. No priest this time, no legal documents that could be weaponized. Just a Shinto priestess Kenji had flown in from Kyoto, who blessed them with sake and sakaki branches and spoke about new beginnings and choosing each other not once, but twice. Eliza wore a simple white dress. Kenji wore a dark suit with no tie. Kai, 8 months old and gloriously chubby, made delighted noises from his grandmother's arms through the entire ceremony. When it was over, Kenji tied a new Omamori charm around Eliza's wrist, a protection blessing but also a promise. No more collateral, he murmured. Only partnership. Only partnership, she agreed, and kissed him like a vow renewed and meant. The years that followed were nothing like the life either of them had imagined. Kenji built a legitimate international art brokerage, leveraging his knowledge and connections without the blood. He was meticulous, transparent, ruthlessly ethical, and, to the shock of everyone who'd known him in his previous life, genuinely content. Eliza consulted remotely, raised Kai, and slowly, carefully, learned to trust the man her husband was becoming. On Kai's 4th birthday, Kenji carried his son on his back through the Uffizi Gallery, pointing out Caravaggio's mastery of chiaroscuro, while Kai demanded to see the painting with the scary baby angels. Eliza walked beside them, her hand in Kenji's free one, and watched the man who'd once commanded a criminal empire kneel down so a 4-year-old could climb on his shoulders. That evening, on the villa's terrace overlooking Florence's glittering lights, she asked, "Do you miss it? The power?" Kenji was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing circles on her hand. "I thought power meant control," he finally said. "I thought if I could control enough variables, I could protect everything that mattered. But power was just fear wearing expensive clothes." He turned to look at her, his eyes clear. "This, Ryū-kai, a life where I don't have to hide who I love or what I've chosen. This is the only thing I was ever actually strong enough to fight for." Years later, when Kai was 7 and asking questions about why his father spoke Japanese and had tattoos he kept covered, Kenji sat him down and told him an age-appropriate version of the truth. That he'd made mistakes, that he'd hurt people, that he'd chosen power over love until he learned what love actually cost. Did you fix it? Kai asked, his dark eyes, Eliza's eyes, solemn and searching. Kenji looked at Eliza, who was listening from the doorway with tears in her eyes. I'm still fixing it, he said honestly. Every day. But your mother gave me the chance to try, which is more than I deserved. That's what love is, Kai said with the absolute certainty of a 7-year-old. Giving people chances. And Kenji Ryū, former Oyabun, reformed criminal, imperfect husband and father, pulled his son close and agreed. If you made it here, through the betrayal and the birth and the slow, painful reconstruction of trust, then you understand something most people don't. The best love stories aren't about perfection. They're about two broken people choosing each other anyway, again and again, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. This community exists because we refuse to settle for fairy tales when the truth is so much more devastating and real. Subscribe. Stay. Let's build something honest together. The kind of story the algorithm won't show you, because it asks too much and gives back everything.